We're going to continue on the same topic with Herman Husband with our next speaker, Dr. Bruce Stewart. Bruce is a professor of history at Appalachian State University. He earned a BA in history at UNC Greensboro and an MA from Western Carolina. In 2007, Bruce earned a PhD in history at the University of Georgia and was hired at App State, where he has taught classes on US and Appalachian history. He's the author or editor of several books, including Moonshiners and Prohibitionists, The Battle Over Alcohol in Southern Appalachia, and Stewart's most recent book, called Redemption from Tyranny, Herman Husband's American Revolution, was published by the University of Virginia Press in 2020. And Bruce was going to join us for our Descendants Gathering program last April, which unfortunately had to be canceled because of COVID. And we're very excited to have him today. His talk is entitled Perfecting a Free Government, Herman Husband's Life After the North Carolina Regulation. Bruce, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jeremiah, for inviting me to speak today. And thank you all for joining this symposium. I do have a PowerPoint. Let me try to share the screen. I want everybody to cross their fingers and make sure that this is going to work. It worked earlier today. Host has disabled participant screen sharing. Sherry, I need to share a screen. All right, here we go. Thank you, Sherry. Somebody let me know if y'all can see this. Just somebody or Sherry, just shout out. All right, good, excellent, excellent. Let me turn on this slideshow then, and let us begin. So what I'm going to talk about today is going to be Herman Husband. And what I decided to do, there's so many things I could talk about, but what I decided to do was to talk about his life after the North Carolina regulation. So we're going to roughly look between the years 1771 all the way up into his death in 1795. And one reason why I decided to talk about his life after the North Carolina regulations, at least for me, when I really, growing up in high school and college, and I knew about the North Carolina regulation. But really, all I knew in terms of Herman Husband was what he did, during the North Carolina regulation. And really, if you read stories about North Carolina regulation, right before the Battle of Alamance, he flees. And, you might hear that he eventually fled to Pennsylvania. And in the 1790s, he ultimately participates in the Whiskey Rebellion. That's really at least all that I knew about him before I really began to research his life. So hopefully for many of y'all might know a lot about what he does during the North Carolina regulation, but hopefully some of y'all, maybe do not know what happens to him after he flees from the Battle of Alamance. So again, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And really what I'm going to be doing is just highlighting some of the things that he does after 1771. I could go on for hours about this topic, but I'm going to try to keep this down about 20, 30 minutes to let y'all guys have time to answer questions. I do very briefly, just in case, Mark actually touched up on a lot of Herman Husband in the 1750s and the 1760s. So what I do want to do, though, is very briefly talk about his life before 1771. And again, Mark's covered a lot of this. Some of y'all might not have also were at the previous presentation. So this is just kind of just very briefly kind of tell you who he was before 1771. Now, Herman Husband was born in 1724. He was actually born in Maryland, Cecil County, Maryland. His father was a wheat farmer, and his father was actually very wealthy. So Herman Husband does not come from humble roots. He grew up a wealthy kid. His father was also an Anglican. So Herman Husband, as he was throughout childhood up until his teen years, he is going to be an Anglican. 1730s, late 1730s, by this time, Herman's 13, 14, 15 years old, and he begins to embrace what is known as the Great Awakening. this religious social movement that sweeps across the American colonies in the 1730s and the 1740s. And this Great Awakening ultimately encourages Herman Husband to reject the Anglican faith of his father and to embrace the new, what are known as the New Lights, or embrace these New Light evangelicals, this Great Awakening. Initially, he's going to join the New Side Presbyterianism, the Presbyterianists. He then, though, is going to believe that they are also a bunch of sellouts, and he also is going to embrace and join the Society of Friends, or the Quakers. And as Mark said previously, he's ultimately going to be expelled from the Quakers in the mid 1760s. So Herman Husband, again, he's from Maryland. He's going to move to the back country of North Carolina, what is now Orange County, in the 1750s. And very quickly, he's going to be able to buy up a lot of land. He's actually going to own around 10,000 acres of land in the back country of North Carolina. So he is one of the most prominent landowners, farmers in that region. Of course, he is going to be a leading figure in the North Carolina regulation between 1766 and 1771. I would consider him more kind of the mouthpiece. He's the guy that's going to write the pamphlets that describe the history, the motives of these regulators in North Carolina. Of course, the Battle of Alamance is the climax of the North Carolina regulation. Of course, their Governor Tryon's going to defeat the regulators on the banks of the Alamance River. But right before that battle begins, Herman Husband, unwilling to, I guess, give up his Quaker beliefs in nonviolence, he's going to flee. And for a lot of histories, that's kind of where the history of the story of Herman Husband ends, right there. So what I want to talk about is what happens to him after he flees from the Battle of Alamance, after he ultimately flees from North Carolina. So let's get into the 1770s here. So, the Battle of Alamance has already happened, and Herman Husband's going to leave. At first, he's going to go back to Maryland for a couple of weeks. And just kind of, regroup. And what he ultimately decides to do is to move to Western Pennsylvania. To be more precise, he ultimately is going to move to Bedford County, Pennsylvania. If you look at the map here on this slide, you can see here the county that's in red. That's where Bedford County is. Moved there for a number of reasons. He had a childhood friend that lived there who was a hunter. So he already knew somebody that lived in the region. The region was also by Forbes Road, which would allow him to continue to communicate with his relatives in Maryland. The main reason, though, that he goes to Bedford County is really the main reason why he went to the backcountry of North Carolina in the 1750s. And that is because he wants land. By the early 1770s, Bedford County is ripe for land speculation. So he's going to move to Bedford County, and very quickly he's going to, establish himself as a farmer. Very quickly he's going to be able to accumulate land. And you can see here from the land records I was able to discover, by 1775 he owned 2,000 acres of land. The average landholder in Bedford County at that time owned around 182 acres of land. So you can see here that he is still a very prominent individual within Bedford County. He doesn't own as much land as he did in North Carolina, but he's still very, he's not, your ordinary common, Joe. Now he's really throughout most of the 1770s, there's not a lot of records on him. So a lot of what I had to do is piece together was through land records, and that's how I discovered how much land that he had. Also court records as well. I was fortunate enough, though, to find an article that he's mentioned in that was published in 1774 in a Pennsylvania newspaper. It's really there when the actual physical evidence of what he's doing happens. So it looks like what happens in July of 1774 is Herman Husband is going to participate in a rally protesting the British government's passage of the Coercive Acts. So definitely by 1774, you can see here he has begun to embrace the patriot cause. He's ultimately going to be a supporter of the American Revolution. He's actually, during that, there's a meeting that takes place in July 1774. And the community comes together and they draw up a list of resolves to send to the government officials, explain why they're opposed to the coercive acts. Also at that meeting, they're going to elect the Committee of Correspondence, members of that committee. And actually Herman Husband's elected as a member of the Committee of Correspondence. So there in 1774, you can kind of see he is already kind of established himself as kind of a leader in that local community, a leader in Bedford County. Early 1775, this comes from some court records, the Bedford County, Pennsylvania court records. He is going to be charged with sedition and disturbing the peace. I'm guessing this was during one of a protest rally against probably more likely than not the coercive acts that previous year. He's released on bail, on bond. And really for the next year, he goes back to court and he says, I'm being a good person, please don't, fine me, et cetera, et cetera. But really for the 1770s, up until 1776, that's really all the hardcore kind of primary sources, the records that I have for him. Definitely by 1776, though, he is, a proponent of the American Revolution. He is going to be a patriot. He's going to embrace the American Revolution with open arms. What he also embraces is Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution. And this Constitution is really the most, I would argue, the most democratic constitution at that time, particularly in the Western world. And that included a number of clauses that Herman Husband considered necessary, crucial for, to use his words, perfecting a free government. So one reason why he is going to embrace this American Revolution is because he ultimately supports this new state constitution in Pennsylvania that is emerges from this conflict. So what are some of those clauses that he is going to support in that in Pennsylvania's constitution? Well, annual elections and term limits. Again, if you have annual elections, that means every year those politicians always have to remain accountable to the citizens, to their voters. Term limits. He's supporting term limits for the same reason many people today are advocating for term limits as well. He also embraces freedom of speech and religion, which is codified in the 1776 Constitution. One thing that he also mentions, and he mentions this in a later pamphlet, though, is that there's a clause that was included in the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution that he really lauds as being crucial, again, to perfecting a free government. And I went ahead and wrote down this clause on this PowerPoint. Let me read it out to you. And I think this, and I'll go on and elaborate on this, but I think this is really crucial to understand his worldview and really understand his actions. Why, in many ways, he's always going to be defiant to what he considers tyranny that's emerging in government. So here again, here's the clause from Pennsylvania's 1776 Constitution. Government is instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, and not for the particular emolument or advantage of any single man, family, or set of men. So what you're seeing here is a fear that Herman Husband had. And I argue that it's not only Herman Husband that has this fear, but it's countless other American settlers, particularly those settlers that are living in the backcountry. I should say that Western Pennsylvania at this time is considered the backcountry, just like, the Piedmont of North Carolina was the backcountry. But there's this fear that if the government institutes a number of policies that allows for the accumulation of wealth amongst a few people, the fear was if only a few people have the wealth, they're ultimately going to use their wealth to control the political system, to kind of rig the marketplace in their favor. And the fear is if you have a republic in which you have these mass accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, those few people in the end are going to use their economic power, their political power, to ultimately exploit the common man, or what he would call the common farmer. So keep that in mind right here. I'm going to elaborate on that point a little bit later here, probably here in a couple of slides. But again, I think that's going to give you a sense of why he's going to be opposed to a lot of things that the Pennsylvania government's doing, a lot of things that the US government is doing in the 1780s. Not to mention why a lot of the things why he was opposed to, the colonial government of North Carolina in the 1760s. Now, in terms of the, can y'all still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay, there we go. My slide wasn't working there. So he is going to support Pennsylvania 1776 Constitution. Again, he believes that's crucial for, the perfecting the free government. He is also going to be a staunch proponent of the American Revolution. He's going to believe that the American Revolution was divinely inspired. So it's something that God is through God, the founding fathers, even if many of those founding fathers are deists, they still are inspired by God to ultimately pave the way for the new millennium. So one thing that he is, and this happens to him in the 1730s, is he is a post-millennialist. And that he believed that the beginning of the millennial would begin in his lifetime. And what he ultimately views the American Revolution is the beginning of the millennium. That the founding fathers, that these patriots are paving the way to creating a just and moral government, a government in which white men own land, that white men are allowed to participate in politics, that white men are going to be allowed to enjoy the fruits of their labor. For him, this is the perfect government. So what he ultimately believes is that the patriots, that the founding fathers and those people that embrace the American Revolution, what they're ultimately going to create is what he calls the New Jerusalem. They're paving the way for the second coming of Jesus Christ. He is going to be elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1777, and he is a constitutionalist. In Pennsylvania at this time, you had two kind of political factions. On one side, you had the Constitutionalists, and as the name implies, they are proponents of that 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution. Pitting against them is a political faction known as the Republicans, also known as the Conservatives. When I say Republican here, I'm not talking about the modern day Republican Party. The modern day Republican Party is founded in the 1850s. So don't confuse those two here. In this case, the Republicans are a political faction, and they are actually opposed, although they support the American Revolution. So both of these, the Constitutionalists and the Republicans, they support the American Revolution. But the Republicans, though, they believe that they're in many ways opposed to the state constitution, and that they believe it gave too much power to the common man. In many ways, they want to tame democracy. So both of these groups, the Constitutionalists and the Republicans, they both embrace the American Revolution, but both sides, though, differ on how far that American Revolution should go towards change. And again, the Constitutionalists are saying we should give more power to the common white man, whereas Republicans are saying, wait, time out, we're not yet, we don't know if they're able yet to actually govern responsibly. So again, Herman Husband is a constitutionalist. He's going to be elected to the Pennsylvania State Assembly in 1777. He's only going to serve for 1 year. And during that year, what he and other legislators are really combating is the problem of inflation. And not only Pennsylvania, but also the American colonies at this time, 1777, 1778, inflation's just skyrocketed. People can't afford, the basic goods. So Herman Husband is going to support a number of things to curb inflation. One, of course, you can see here on the PowerPoint is price controls. Make sure that a baker, for instance, isn't charging exorbitant amounts for a loaf of bread to people. And that's really not that radical. Most constitutionalists support that. Even some of the Republicans supported price controls. There is one thing, though, that I think is of note that really shows how outside the box Herman Husband was when it comes to his thinking here. And this, what he ultimately proposes, and he proposes this to a number of assemblymen who are constitutionalists. And make a long story short with that, the constitutionalists, the people that he submits this proposal to, they kind of laugh at him. They're like, dude, you're way too crazy. That's going to be another thing I'll talk about too, is how really the elite would always view Herman Husband as kind of a quack, as one prominent politician called him the madman of Bedford. But what he ultimately proposes, one way to combat that inflation, is he actually proposes to overhaul the entire monetary system of Pennsylvania. And one thing that he argues is that paper currency should no longer be backed by specie. When I say specie, I'm talking about gold and silver. And what he ultimately argues there is if this paper, to make it valuable, if it's backed by those metals, gold and silver, the problem that he sees is that the price of gold and silver always fluctuates. It might go up real high at one time. It might, the value of gold and silver might, plummet one time. For him, that ultimately means that it makes the price of that currency always fluctuate. And oftentimes it ultimately is going to lead to inflation. So here's kind of a lot of people are already scratching their head and saying, wait a second, you don't want to back currency with gold and silver. That's insane. What he also proposes is to create a new currency in Pennsylvania. And that currency, first of all, would not be backed by gold and silver. And what he ultimately wants to do is what that bill ultimately is going to do, I just have it written down here, is depreciate in value annually at a set rate. So basically, it's this piece of paper that would be a piece of currency. And you would actually have a depreciation scale on that piece of paper that tells you exactly how much that piece of paper, that currency, is worth. And slowly through 33 and a half or a third years, the value of that piece of paper is going to decline. So for him, why he thought this was a good idea was, A, it would help control inflation, and that the price of that bill would steadily, decrease. While the price of that bill is decreasing, then, you could issue more cash into newer bills, I should say, into the economy. So that would kind of control, in many ways, stop inflation. He also believed that that would stop the hoarding of money as well. One of the problems that the backcountry is experiencing in the 1780s, and the same thing that it was experiencing in the 1760s, is that there's just not a lot of currency. And if you create this new bill that basically declines in value through time, he believes that that's ultimately going to prevent people from hoarding that money. So if you're not hoarding that money, then that money can then be circulated back into the economy. It's going to allow farmers to get their hands on that money. And because they have that actual money, they can then pay off their debts, or they can buy things that they might want. Again, he proposes, he talks to a couple of constitutionalists. He proposes this plan to them, and they basically say, just lay it aside here. You're even, no, that's just ridiculous. Paper or currency not being backed by specie. He's also going to, let me do this. It keeps on messing up here. He's also going, hopefully this will work again here. He's also going to support progressive taxation on the land. So one thing that he's going to argue is that the more wealth you have, the more landed wealth you have, the higher amount of taxes you're ultimately going to have to pay. There we go. Progressive tax on land. Okay, so in the late 1770s, early 1780s, Herman Husband's going to continue to embrace the American Revolution. Again, he believes that the American Revolution is going to allow for the beginning of the second coming of Christ, the beginning of the millennial. Remember, he's a post-millennialist. What's going to happen, though, in the 1780s is a number of things are going to happen at both the state and the national level that's going to begin to make Herman Husband question his faith in the American Revolution, to question his faith in the new republic. So what I want to talk about these next slides are some of those events, some of those things that ultimately are going to make Herman Husband begin to, in the end, oppose the US Constitution, to oppose George Washington, to ultimately embrace what is known as the Whiskey Rebellion in the 1790s. So one thing that happens in the 1780s, to kind of place things in kind of a larger kind of context here, is you have a horrible economic recession. in not only Pennsylvania, but also throughout the entire, I guess we can call them American states now. And that a growing number of farmers, particularly those in the backcountry, are going into debt. In many ways, it's the same thing that you see that was occurring in the backcountry of North Carolina in the 1760s. A growing number of these farmers are going in debt. They can't pay off, whether it's taxes or their debt to their creditor. They can't pay those off, so what ultimately happens? They're going to be forced to sell off their land. So one thing that you're going to see as a result of this economic recession is that a growing number of farmers in Western Pennsylvania, and not only Western Pennsylvania, but also throughout, particularly the backcountry of the United States, they are finding themselves losing their land. And in this society, the key to economic independence is through land ownership. So Herman Husband's alarmed here. Again, he's seeing that there you have this economic recession, and a number of common people, these common white farmers, are increasingly going into debt. They are increasingly beginning to lose their land. In essence, they're losing their economic independence. One thing that alarms Herman Husband is the fiscal policies of the Republicans in Pennsylvania. As we get into the 1780s, the Republicans, remember there was those two political factions, the Constitutionalists and the Republicans. The Republicans, though, in Pennsylvania in the 1780s, they're going to seize power. They're going to seize control over the state legislature. And they're going to issue a number of economic policies that Herman Husband is going to oppose. And again, when I'm saying this, keep in mind what's going on in the 1780s with that economic recession, with a lot of these farmers unable to pay off their debts and increasingly losing their land. So for these Republicans, when it came to rejuvenating, reviving Pennsylvania's government, what they believed that the key to kind of that revival, that key to economic recovery, was really instituting laws that favored the creditors. Or what they call the mercantile part of society. So one thing that you're seeing, I should have mentioned this a few minutes ago, is increasingly in Pennsylvania, and this is true, I think, throughout the other states, is you're really seeing the emergence of two groups of people within white society. One, you have a growing number of people who are becoming debtors. They're part of the debtor class. And then you have another group who are the creditors. So what the Republicans believe is that we need, in order to revive this government, what we ultimately do is pass laws that favor these creditors, that allow these creditors to ultimately get that money that's back due to them. And once they're able to get that money that's due to them, they can then initiate economic improvements. Maybe they could start more businesses, for instance, with that capital that they're able to accumulate. So one thing that the Republicans in Pennsylvania, when they seize power in the 1780s, are going to begin to do is they're really going to crack down on debtors in Pennsylvania and also taxpayers as well. So give you a couple of examples here. And again, these things are things that are really alarming Herman Husband. For debtors, for instance, under the Pennsylvania, as we get into the 1780s, debtors are going to have to settle loans in specie. So let's say if you own money to somebody, you could no longer pay them in paper currency. You would have to pay them in gold or silver, your debtor in gold or silver. The problem, though, is, you probably guessed it by now, is there a lot of gold and silver in Western Pennsylvania at this time? No, there's not. So as you can see there, a lot of these farmers aren't going to be able to pay off their debts, and they're in turn going to ultimately lose their land. Also, new taxes are going to be payable only in gold or silver as well. So now if you're a farmer and you have to pay whatever tax it might be, you can no longer use paper currency. You have to pay your taxes in either gold or silver. Again, there's not a lot of gold or silver in the backcountry. You're not able to do that. You're continuing to go into debt. You can kind of see what's going on here and why Herman Husband's going to be so alarmed at the plight of a lot of these common, what he would call the common farmer. And for these new taxes, the rationale with the Republicans by these taxes paid only in species, that they believed it was a good way to really put sound money into the state's coffer. And also with that sound money, you could then balance the budget. So the question here, and I've kind of alluded to this a little bit, is why is Herman Husband going to be opposed to these policies that are being enacted by these Republicans in the 1780s? It all boils down to, I think, how he viewed white society at this time. And I argue that it's not only Herman Husband that believes this, but it is other farmers, particularly white farmers at that time, and that they view white society as being divided into two factions. On the one hand, you have what are known as the laboring many. And Herman Husband would include himself as being part of the laboring many. This would be farmers, whether it's a yeoman farmer or a tenant farmer. It would be artisans, people that are, creating crafts, baskets, whatever it might be. And also wage earners as well. These are the laboring many. These are people, in other words, who through the sweat of their labor, they are creating something of value. So a farmer, by working the fields, by improving that land, by building a fence, by building a house, he's making improvements to that land. In essence, he is creating property. Pitting the laboring many is going to be what Herman Husband would call the idle rich, or what many other people would call the unworking few. These would be people that gain their money, gain their power off the fruits of another man's labor. So it'd be someone like a creditor, for instance, or an absentee landowner, or a banker, or a lawyer, or a bond speculator. So Herman Husband, and I think other common people this time, this is where they really view these divisions within white society. We are part of the laboring many, and that unworking few is always trying to exploit us from enjoying the fruits of our labor. So for Herman Husband, what he's ultimately viewing, what he's ultimately afraid of, is that in Pennsylvania, he's increasingly going to see this throughout what he believes happening throughout the American government, is that people are the few, the unworking few, are now beginning to accumulate enough wealth in which they're beginning to control the political system, and in turn, that's going to allow them to begin to exploit the common man. Herman Husband is, again, you can see how Herman Husband is going to start being a little bit disturbed here. Another thing that he's going to be opposed of is the US Constitution, particularly certain articles, parts of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, basically does a lot of the things that those Republicans in Pennsylvania were doing, basically forcing those debtors to begin to pay back their loans in gold or silver. It also denies state governments from actually issuing paper currency anymore as well. So again, Herman Husband, particularly with Article 1, Section 8, he's beginning to view the U.S. Constitution, this new republic, as being a tool used by that unworking few to exploit the laboring many. What he's also opposed to is going to be large congressional districts that are created under the U.S. Constitution. And what he ultimately fears is that really, if you have in essence, these large congressional districts, you have tens of thousands of people in these districts. And his fear is, because you have so many people in these districts, the common man, it might be a good, virtuous man who might only own 50 acres of land, but he's a good man and he has the interests of everybody else at heart. He's not well known, though, amongst 10,000, 20,000 people. For him, the people that most likely going to be elected to office are those people who are most known, the most well known. And for him, that's going to be those unworking few. So he is going to fear that increasingly what you're seeing with the U.S. Constitution, particularly these large congressional districts, is ultimately going to be these unworking few who are going to be elected to office. And again, with that political power, they are then going to rig the system against the common man. I'm going to skip through this right here. If somebody wants to ask me about this later on, I see I'm falling a little short on time. Let me just get to the Whiskey Rebellion. So that's what we're ultimately beginning to see as we get into the late 1780s, as we get into 1790, 1791. Herman Husband is beginning to lose faith in this new republic. And it's at that time he really begins to publish pamphlets that begins to embrace what he calls the Western New Jerusalem. What he ultimately believes is those settlers who are going to move past the Appalachian Mountains into Trans-Appalachia, they, in essence, are going to create a new Jerusalem. What he ultimately believes by 1790 is that the US government, that George Washington, they have grown too corrupt, that they are working in league with the unworking few. So he's going to begin to really preach this through his pamphlets and also actual, what I think, actual word of mouth as well. Basically telling these people, you know, we have a duty to create this new Jerusalem. We have a duty to ultimately to resist this corrupt government that has been formed, that's trying to exploit the laboring many. And as I said, I said this a few minutes ago, a lot of the elite are going to scoff at Herman Husband, but the common man is going to support him. I mean, you can see this through, he's elected to a number of offices during the 1780s in Bedford County. You can see here, county commissioner, he was elected constable, tax collector, overseer of the poor, supervisor of highways. He's also elected to the state assembly in 1789. The point here, as you can see, is that although the elite are kind of picking on him, picking on his ideas, really calling him a quack, the crazy man of Bedford, the common people, though, he strikes a chord, much like he did in the 1760s. And the common person is going to ultimately view them as being, you know, as a champion for them. I'm going to be really brief right here. I really want to leave time for some questions. So Herman Husband is going to participate in the Whiskey Rebellion. He does not play a big of a role in the Whiskey Rebellion as he does in the North Carolina regulation, but he is a participant in some of the key committees or gatherings that take place during the Whiskey Rebellion. You can see here in August 14th, 1794, he is a delegate at the Parkinson's Valley Convention. You can see here he's also a member of what's known as the Committee of 60 at Redstone Old Fort. And I would argue that he's a moderate, though. And this is another similarity with Herman Husband in the 1760s. Is, you know, we kind of view him as a radical, kind of a rabble razzle. But when it came to actually, you know, enacting reform, he does not advocate the use of violence. Those people in the 1760s who are saying, you know, we need to take up arms, and it's the same thing that happens during the Whiskey Rebellion. Those people are saying we need to take up arms, we need to secede from the United States, we need to, you know, attack federal officials. It's always Herman Husband saying, wait a second, guys, let's take a more moderate approach here. Let's petition. Let's enact reform change through the ballot box. So in many ways, Herman Husband is a moderate, particularly when you compare him to more militants, not only during the North Carolina regulation, but also during the Whiskey Rebellion. Make a long story short, Herman Husband's going to be arrested by federal troops, militia, I guess, in October 1794. He's going to be taken to Pennsylvania. By this time, he's 69, 70 years old. There, he's going to, in Pennsylvania, he's going to be in a jail. He's going to stay there until June 3rd, 1795. On that day, he's going to be acquitted of sedition, charges of sedition. He somehow, he's still in Pennsylvania, and as he's making his way west to go back to Bedford County, on the outskirts of Pennsylvania, probably around June the 18th, he's actually going to die. He actually had pneumonia. He actually falls off his horse. They take him to a tavern, and he's ultimately going to die, I think, on June 18th. He's actually buried on June the 19th. And we have, to this day, we have no idea exactly where he is buried. It's somewhere on the outskirts, though, of Pennsylvania. I could go on a lot longer, but I do want to save time for questions. So I think I'll stop right there. Let me turn off this, stop the share.
All right. Thank you, Bruce. Everybody, if you've got questions about this presentation, please go ahead and put them into the chat box, and I will relay them. Um, Bruce, I'm one of those people who tells the story of Herman Husband through the lens of the regulator movement, and the Whiskey Rebellion is almost like a little bit of an addenda, and just I tack it on at the end and say, this he goes and does something kind of similar in Pennsylvania after the Revolutionary War, and is very interesting for me to hear you talk about this and see some of the similarities with what was going on in North Carolina in the 1760s and what was going on in Pennsylvania, especially available currency. And what I'm curious to know is at any point does Herman Husband seem to look back on his experience in North Carolina and use any kind of lesson learned, or basically refer back to what he experienced in the 1760s through 1771 when he's in Pennsylvania?
He doesn't. There was in I think it's Eli Carruthers' book, was published in 1840, where he interviews a lot of former regulators. There is this, and there's no way I can confirm this, but there was this idea that he actually goes down to Virginia. There's some Quakers at that time who were imprisoned for basically refusing to take up arms, but they're imprisoned by the Patriots. And supposedly he makes the argument that in terms of the millennial, he argues that that's what I had in mind, during the North Carolina regulation. But in his pamphlets in the 1780s, he does not mention the North Carolina regulation, which I thought was interesting. What he does mention when he goes back in time, though, is the Pennsylvania's Constitution of 1776. Again, those things. What I think he really believed in 1776, 1777 is that the Pennsylvania State Constitution was the kind of the blueprint for kind of perfecting this federal government. So when it comes to the 1780s, he's no longer looking at the North Carolina regulation as kind of a guidepost, but it's more 1776, 1777. Also, when he's writing these pamphlets, it's for public consumption. Most people in Pennsylvania, I mean, they're going to relate more to 1776 than the 1760s in the North Carolina backcountry. So I think he's also thinking about who his audience is. As well. But I looked hard when I was reading those pamphlets. They're not the most enjoyable things to read, too. But yeah,
he's got a very very specific writing style that's interesting to get through. I'm curious. You mentioned that you find him to be more of a moderate among the leadership in the Whiskey Rebellion, and it seems like is he in less of a leadership position, or like much less of a leadership position in North Carolina, or than he was in North Carolina? And do you think that there's a little bit of like a tempering of his views, maybe because of what he's been through before?
I think he's less of a leader in the Whiskey Rebellion than the North Carolina regulation. For the North Carolina regulation, I think he is. To get back to a question someone asked Mark in the last presentation, why he was so appealing is he's able to tap into the anxieties of people at that time, whether it's the 1760s or the 1780s, and he's really able to articulate their fears. But he is educated. He's able to write. So in many ways, he becomes, I always call him the spokesperson of the North Carolina regulation. That's kind of his role in the North Carolina regulation, is to kind of put the word out, to present the history, a sympathetic history concerning the regulators. But behind the scenes, even if you read the Impartial Relation, he's always, saying there are these other guys that are always pushing for more violence, and guys, just step back. That's not going to work. Let's petition. And it's the same kind of thing that he does in Pennsylvania. The funny thing with the Pennsylvania, during the court records, I was able to track down his actual the court testimony. Many people in Bedford County were opposed to Herman Husband as we get into 1774 because of his moderation. And they actually threatened to tar and feather Herman Husband, because Herman Husband's not willing to take that extra step of engaging in violence, in actually wanting to secede from the federal government. So for many whiskey rebels, I mean, they begin to, dude, you're gone soft. No, that's not the way that we need to do things. So that was something I found very surprising as well.
See, yeah, that makes me really wonder how you can't say, hey, let me tell you a story about 1771 and what happens when you go down this road, and why, if it were me and I were in a totally new place and I was seeing the same things happening, I don't know that I would have talked that much about what happened in North Carolina, because people are going to go, oh yeah, what happened next? Well, it doesn't really end that well. So it's interesting.
I think the story of Herman Husband that tells you, like, I think when we think of North Carolina regulation, we only look at it in North Carolina, but there's actually, I mean, it is the largest agrarian uprising before the American Revolution, but it's not the only agrarian uprising in the American colonies. I mean, I consider the North Carolina regulation is just part of kind of a series of agrarian kind of farmer revolts that's taking place. And it's the same thing in the 1760s that takes place in the 1780s. So there's continuity. I'm going here. And as you said, a lot of the things that Herman Husband saw in the 1760s, he's seeing those things in the 1780s. In many ways, he makes the argument, and this is the argument that other people make, is, wow, George Washington and that new government, they're acting very much like those British were acting back in the early 1770s. Or even go back, very much like Edmund Fanning was acting like, or Governor Tryon in the 1760s.
Yeah, there are a couple of people I've had conversations with, recently over the past few months whose ears are burning right now, because we've been talking about some of these same things where, the regulation really fits into this much larger story of agrarian revolts, and you hit the nail on the head. So let me take a look at a couple questions here. Larry wants to know, where was Herman Husband in jail? Was he imprisoned in Philadelphia? Where exactly is he geographically?
Philadelphia.
Okay.
That's
okay.
where
And then he's on his way back to Bedford County.
He's on the outskirts of Philadelphia when he passes away. My guess, again, there's no documentation here, just kind of, oral histories of him having pneumonia. My guess is he got sick during jail. I mean, he's 70 years old. He spends 7 months in jail. He's probably sick during the trial, probably sick after the trial, and probably is thinking, well, I just need to get home. And I guess he makes a go for it and isn't able to make it back to Bedford County. Again, he dies outskirts of Philadelphia. And again, we don't know where he's buried, which leads me to believe that Amy didn't come to Philadelphia to see him. I think if he had relatives there, they would have taken his body back to Bedford County.
Yeah, one would think so. Well, Bruce, thank you so much. I'm going to let anybody who's got extra questions that they come up with, go ahead and type them in the chat. Bruce can see the chat as well, and we'll be able to respond there. We have got one more break, and then we're going to be back at 2 o'clock for our final presentation of the day from Van Evans. Sherry, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, thank you. We will see you all back at 2 o'clock. Thank you for joining us.